time for discussion because they seem to be the main point of this conference. We'll start immediately, and I've actually had a request from some of the speakers to introduce them as quickly as possible so they have more time to present and more time to discuss. We have three papers, very different. One of them is a multi-country analysis of 20 countries, and we'll start with that. Then there's an abstract take on the concept of métissage, and then we have a very concrete case study of an Estonian party. Our first speaker is Per Schepers from Radboud University in Nijmegen. It's a collective paper, but I understand you're presenting it in the name of your colleagues.
Yes.
And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. So these days I've learned a lot, particularly in appreciating the very different angles and perspectives that my colleagues live by and try to produce their papers. Well, I'm actually more or less a black dove in your company because I'm a straightforward empirical scientist standing in a tradition of, trying to address huge questions, coming up with theoretical perspective from which I will derive testable hypotheses, and then I will take advantage of big databases that are available to all of the scientific community. And I will introduce these data sets to you, particularly because they are so relevant to the phenomenon of nationalism in the purpose of our study. So, this will be the structure of my presentation. I will tell you something about the concept of nationalism in my line of research. I'll introduce my research questions, talk a bit about the theories, but more particularly about the hypothesis that will be derived from them. Tell you something about the data. I will try to provoke you with descriptive findings on a number of countries. Then I'll bring out some more multivariate statistical analysis and try to tell you about the findings from the multi-level analysis that I've performed. And I will conclude and put forward some issues of discussion. Well, first about the definitions. So, you said, well, we more or less know what we are talking about. But I find it easy to come up with some kind of definition. And the definition that is prevalent in my line of research, actually going back to social psychology, psychology more in general, also political science, is about the distinction between nationalism and patriotism. This has come up in the course of our discussions, but I'd like to put it more neatly on the table. Nationalism, as we see it, is by definition that one is very proud of their country, one's country. It's viewed as unique and superior. So that's important. What is more important is that the nation's superiority is established as seen as such as compared to other countries. And there is some kind of blind attachment to this nation. Whereas patriotism is about, being proud of the achievements of your country, being proud of the sports achievements, the economic achievements, political power in the world. However, the distinction is there's still this critical understanding of the nation as such. And in this particular paper, I prefer to go into nationalism, not into patriotism, because in previous studies we found that nationalism is the virulent version, because this nationalism is strongly correlated to exclusion of migrants, whereas patriotism is a kind of friendly nationalism, if you will, which is not correlated to these first virulent exclusion of minorities. So only on nationalism in this paper. My research questions are huge. I like to establish the differences between countries and the trends within countries in terms of nationalism. And once I've found these differences, I will try to explain these differences with individual and national characteristics. I'll tell you something about theories. Ethnic competition theory is much more strongly elaborated than localism theory. The theory, ethnic competition theory, is actually a blend of a social identity theory is really outstanding in social psychology, one of the main theories in this line of research. A realistic conflict theory actually comes from sociology. And the mix between these theories I've proposed in previous publications can be seen as a general proposition that there is a strong competition between ethnic groups in societies, both on the individual level as well as on the contextual level, and this induces perceived threat. People belonging to groups perceive the other groups as a threat to their scarce resources. And due to this threat, they are driven into both nationalism and, on the other hand, exclusion of minorities in the country. Well, if you take these propositions seriously, you can come up with hypotheses like the ones that are on the table. It's about competitive conditions in countries. And competitive conditions are there when there is increasing numbers of people competing for the same amount of scarce resources. That is, when there are lots of refugees coming into the country, there are more people to compete for the same amount of resources, which actually boils down to a situation of more conflict. The same happens when there are stable numbers of people competing for the diminishing resources, which happens when there is less work, more unemployment. Competition becomes heavier between ethnic groups. So this boils down to these typical hypotheses that nationalism will be stronger in countries with larger migration groups and with more unemployment. So that's a static version. But there is also a more dynamic version that nationalism would increase when there is increasing competition, particularly when there is a growing migrant population coming in, on when there is increasing unemployment in the country. On the individual level, it's about who is actually competing for these scarce resources. Well, you well know that it's particularly the people in the lower strata that have to compete more severely for these scarce resources. So it has to be the lowly educated people who are more in favor of nationalism. It has to be the people in low incomes. It has to be the people who are unemployed, who would favor nationalism more than the other groups in societies. And the other thing is that there's really a mechanism here behind, and that is the perception of threat in the face of the other groups that have come into the country, that drives nationalism and that drives, more in general, exclusionary measures, policies of migrants. Localism theory is much less elaborated. It's actually quite an old theory. It's about local attachment. Local attachment to a society that used to be so cozy and nice, and then all these strangers come in and they disrupt this cozy society, and the people who would feel very much attached to this local community, these are the ones that are driven to nationalism because they want to get out these migrants that have come in. Theory says that this local attachment would be very strongly prevalent among elderly people, the ones who voted for Brexit, religious people, and those who attend church frequently. And again, the mechanism behind this is attachment to local communities that drives nationalism. One more theory, really from, well, on the political science and communication science range of theories, And we discussed this yesterday with Uwe Bakkes. So the radical rights, once they enter the political arena, they change the agenda of also other democratic parties. Because they put on the agenda the immigrants as a difficult issue, sexual rights for minorities, but also in defense of Christian traditions against Muslim traditions. And the proposition is that the more right-wing representatives are in the political arena, the more they will affect the political discourse and the more they will try to stimulate nationalism as such. Again, you find this, well, a stable, static version and a dynamic version of the hypothesis. When there is a large share of representatives, they will affect nationalism in the country. But if there is an increasing share of right-wing extremists in the political arena, they will also affect this discourse and nationalism. Something about the data. So this is derived from the International Social Survey program, started out in the late 80s. And I was involved in the first national identity module that started out in 1995. It has been repeated in 2003, 2013, which provides data for many citizens in many countries. And the quality of these data is just fine. That is, these data represent nations included in the data collection. So we have a large database. More in general, this International Social Survey program does not only tap into national identity issues, but they have chosen a number of issues on which they have repeated data collections.
Just the number of respondents. This is across all the times, or is it just for each year?
Across all the times.
Across all the times.
Yes. 3 waves of data collections, each one about 20,000, something a bit less. Something about the measurements. Once you've defined your concepts, you have to operationalize it straightforwardly. And I think the measurements do fit the definition of nationalism. One item is, I would rather be a citizen of Poland rather than of any other country in the world. Well, this clearly indicates superiority, if you wish, of the country, or uniqueness of the country. The world would be a better place if people were from other countries who were more like Polish. Very superior item, so closely matches the definition of nationalism. People should support their country even if the country is wrong. This is the kind of blind attachment that is so closely defined in nationalism. So these items, only 3, really tap into the phenomenon of nationalism as defined. Some figures is that it's not only valid, but it's also reliable, and it turns out to be reliable over time in so many countries in Western and Eastern societies. I won't tell you about the individual background variables, these are all straightforward. I will tell you about the perception of threat, because this measurement has been included in many surveys, has been shown to be valid and reliable. I won't tell you something about localism, because it's a very straightforward measurement. I won't tell you about the contextual measurements, because they have all been derived from outstanding international sources that made sure that these measurements were comparable across countries and over time. I will tell you something about the findings. As you see, these are the means across the countries and across time. And without any knowledge of statistics, I hope you would agree that there isn't much to do here. It's all the same. No much changes. When you look in countries, there are some changes yet. You see there's a spaghetti of differences in periods. What are the differences? At the lower end, you'll find West Germany, Slovakia, that seem to increase nationalism. Great Britain is stable. Some countries, it seems to be decrease in nationalism. What's important about this picture, that if you look at it from without statistics, there's some kind of countries going up and some kind of countries going down. So in the long run, there seems to be some kind of convergence of nationalism in these countries. If you take it from a statistical point of view, and I only want you to focus on the last column, you see there's not much happening in these countries. There are huge differences between countries, but differences within countries are overall rather stable. Some countries decrease a bit, some countries increase a bit, but it's not very much. And if I ignore the periods and just focus on the differences between countries, then the picture becomes clearer. You see here some countries are higher, so this is Hungary and Bulgaria, Poland also, but Austria also, relatively high. Relatively low are the countries, my country, Germany's, and France, that are relatively low. Well, you can speculate a lot about these things. I won't do, because I will be interested in telling you about the multi-level analysis. Well, you don't have to have statistical knowledge, but I can tell you that if you look at the variance, then there is a lot of variance at the individual level. There's some variance at the country level, but there is no variance at the within countries levels. This means, another way of saying, there are huge differences between countries. Within countries, there is only small differences. I won't tell you about the ways of analysis that I've conducted, but I will tell you about the findings. What did we find? Migrant stock explains predominantly differences in nationalism between countries. That is, the higher the stock of migrants in the country, the lower the level of nationalism. Unemployment is not significant, doesn't matter. Radical right is important. The higher the share of representatives in the political arena in a country, the higher the level of nationalism. I told you about the changes. The changes in migrant stock, unemployment, and radical right are non-significant. They don't matter for nationalism. Age is important. The higher the age, the more nationalistic. It's particularly a phenomenon of males. Education is important. The higher the level of education, the lower the level of nationalism, or vice versa. The lower the level of education, the higher the level of nationalism. It's particularly a phenomenon that you can find among Catholics and Protestants as compared to people who are not related to any religion. It's particularly found among the people who frequently attend church. It's found among the low-income people, and it's not found among the unemployed, so it's not significant. However, nationalism is again found among people who do domestic work. These must be predominantly housewives, sick or disabled person, but also among the retired, which is not surprising because it's also a phenomenon that we find among elderly people, the one who voted for Brexit. Important is this. The mechanisms behind it is the threat mechanism. Those who perceive migrants as a threat, they favor nationalism. And it's also about localism. Those attached to the local community are driven to nationalism. Conclusions. So this was fast, isn't it? Trends, overall rather stable. Also within country. Only marginal changes within countries over a long period of time. Actually a pattern that I found time and again. Between countries, large differences. But there seems to be some convergence between countries over time. That's the spaghetti pattern that I showed you. Explanations for the between-country differences. Limited support for ethnic competition theory. That is, only more nationalism in countries with large representation of the radical right. But less support in countries with larger migrant population. And this is really at odds with the ethnic competition theory and could be explained by context theory. Explanations for within-country differences over time, no significant effects. I've shown you the differences within countries over time are only marginal, and we found no explanations for that. Explanation for differences between individuals, very clear and in line with ethnic competition theory. It's about the lower educated people, it's about the lower income groups. In general, it's about those who perceive ethnic minorities as a threat, are driven to nationalism. It's not among the unemployed, which may come as a surprise. In line with localism theory, it is about the lower educated, it is about the elderly, the Christian denomination, those who frequently attend church. Those are the ones who are attracted to nationalism. And more in general, it's among those who are firmly attached to the local community that are driven to nationalism. Some discussion for you. Well, I'm in the line of testing theories. So I found that ethnic competition theory doesn't do much for us in terms of explaining the differences between countries. So yesterday I heard some other explanations, but I cannot tell whether they are wrong or true. Should it be about liquid modernity? Sigmund Bauman, I don't know what it is. Ontological insecurity? Giddens, never heard about that. In terms of operationalizations, need for recognition, may have something to do with social identity theory. But I would be happy if you could tell me something about these theories and about the operationalizations to be tested in this line of research. Particularly, I would be thankful if you could tell me something about the changes over time, because these are minor. So it's not about changes, it's about stability. How is it possible that in these countries, in so many countries, changes in these countries are only marginal as compared to the differences within countries? Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And because we're already over time, we're going to start immediately with our next speaker, Helge Wendt, who is a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. And Helge, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Still have to change the presentation. Good morning, everybody. The paper I delivered focused on the question of how European historiography from different decades dealt with the issue of heterogeneity and cultural and biological blending in relation to the nation state. Using this paper as a basis, I would like to present some more general considerations of a maybe more theoretical character. In order to frame my proposition in this conference setting, I am proposing an alternative possibility of analyzing in history the interrelatedness of groups in a national society that by predefinition is heterogeneous. I propose to discuss three major problems related to my proposition to introduce the concept of métissage into European national historiography. I propose métissage as an alternative approach advocating both a revisionist usage of past and present European historiography, relevant for the present situation, and a new mode of analyzing and narrating the histories of European states, nations, societies, and territories. Let's start with the first part, global history, globalization, and the future of European historiography. Métissage is a colonial concept used by colonial powers such as Spain, France, and Portugal since the 18th century or slightly earlier to organize colonial societies and to erect social boundaries that were related to racist classification systems. Since the 1990s, it has become an instrument. The concept of métissage has become an instrument for colonial historians to describe developments in colonial societies regarding socio-biological and socio-cultural settings or processes. My first point in considering studies on métissage is those processes were separated from developments happening in European societies and observed by historiography in a way differentiating between the colonial and the European spheres. Historiography stated that European societies, even those of the colonizing states, evolved differently to societies in colonized states, although historiography recognized that European societies acted in colonies and that colonial elements reached European societies. Nevertheless, the influence from the colonies was never strong enough to alter the mother country's structures. My second point considers more European historiography with case studies either in Europe or in the colonies. Despite the fact of the separation in historical and societal evolution during the past, mostly European concepts of societies, political organization, cultural production, etc., were used and applied, including in non-European contexts. This relocation of European analytical tools to non-European contexts engendered a delayed production of independent or context-based methods in non-European areas. Métissage seems to be one of the few concepts that has a non-European background. The subject was and is situated outside of Europe. The historical processes happened outside of Europe, and the adaptation of the concept, be it in historiography or in political national ideology, evolved outside of Europe. So we deal with a double separation here. First, a separation of colonial history from European history, a separation of subject-related methodologies between Europe and the former colonial territories. My point is that living in a, let's say, globalized world with migration flows, political intermediateness, and continuous interlocal observations between the territories which formerly were colonized and by European states with territories which formerly were colonizing states, I have some difficulties to consider these separations as still being valid or being a valid mode of writing history today. I would like to propose to integrate both methodologically and epistemologically those colonizing and colonized territories and to appropriate the concept of métissage for the European context without repeating former forms of expropriation. The first step is an experiment to find out whether such kinds of transmission of a non-European concept into the European historical and historiographical context would be possible. Second, parts, and totalities. My research in European historiography was a first step of this endeavor. The extraction of the research I presented in my paper should already show that at any time some parts of European historiography asked the question if European national societies were as homogeneous as they presented to be by ideological reasons. Historiography in the 19th, the early and the later 20th centuries in France, Germany, Spain, and England, and there you see I'm not an expert in Polish or other histories or historiographies, so I'm concentrating on those. They asked the question if the society under investigation was influenced by groups outside the studied national territory. They furthermore considered the presence of differences inside the socio-cultural and socio-biological composition of a national society. These differences in the parts of a national body, to employ an organic metaphor used historically, consisted in differences in language, legal traditions, habits, ethnicity, production modes, societal structures, and many more other features. So I'm going through some of the studies I presented. The Romans, in the case of Theodor Mommsen in his Römische Geschichte, you might be familiar with, the Romans were a kind of ethnic oligarchy without any ethnic belonging. The Greeks, in the Niebuhr's study on Alexander and the Greeks depicted a maximum of a kin-related heterogeneity. Germans, in Friedrich Meinecke's writings, were a nation of many legal traditions and in a steady exchange with neighboring France. The English working class of E.P. Thompson is a multi-ethnical and multi-religious, politically diverse group. Spanish history, regardless if using or if rejecting Castro's account of convivencia, is about a violent past shared by three different religious groups. And finally, the French in Lucien Febvre's and François Crouzet's studies of literacy in history were regionally, administratively, and linguistically diversified. Although those historians answered the question of national heterogeneity differently and often negatively, all of these eminent historians dealt with the contradictory history of national genesis that showed heterogeneity but aimed to depict a pure nation and only one national history. The term collective totality, which I employed in my paper, serves the purpose of recognizing a nation and a national society without suppressing and obliterating its multi-layered and multi-structured history. There is no single nor monolithic nation that can show a history which is in itself self-explanatory. This quotation of Arnold Toynbee's, who ironically singled out Great Britain, was a kind of headword for the historiography of international relations on the modern and the modern state system. We deal here with the relation of an entity with another and its mutual influences. Toynbee's quotation could be used in researching history on another scale. When a nation is not self-explanatory, could it be that a nation is not a self, or that we deal with many collective actors inside the national framework? The historiographical inquiry that follows is neither to single those national parts out, nor to take them for a pars pro toto of the national community. These parts are themselves collective totalities, and they can only be understood by relating them to the national framework they acted in. From that, a third scale of investigation becomes visible, the question of how those or some parts inside the national framework interacted and how their interactions formed the nation and shaped unifying tendencies. As a nation could act internationally, parts of a nation could cross borders and interact with another national framework's part. We have to consider that even national and nationalistic currents inside one national framework acted and ideologized in correspondence with those foreign parts. Blending and its violence is the third and last part of my talk. My last point is a response in advance to those who think that métissage hybridity or multiculturalism consists only in not taking account of differences, quarrels, and violence. What métissage does is that it also includes those currents in a society that advocate an exclusive and purist ideology and act violently against those who challenge this worldview. This is possible because métissage would place ideologized thinking and acting into a context of correspondence with other tendencies inside and outside one national framework. The pretending exclusive parts exists only as such because the part they act against belongs to a common ideal or real totality, for example, a nation, the Occident, or Christianity. In an essay I am about to publish, I call this figure the blending unblended, joining together the self-reflection of a radical detachment with the overarching historiographical perspective, which denies the possibility that a difference could exist on its own. Ontologically, a difference is always related to at least one counterpart, and thus exists only in a mutual relationship. Here, a broad range of possible relationships show up, from war to fusion, from dialogue to polemics, from trading to exclusion, from inclusion to exploitation, and many more. Métissage would deal with a nation as a collective entity of strongly and asymmetrically interrelated differences, which themselves can maintain stronger or weaker ties with parts of other entities. When one group intends to surpass or even to eliminate another part of a national society, we deal with a process of métissage, as this violent group recognizes that social reality does not correspond with ideological expectations. This point is by no means trivial. When we take a position in present political debates in Europe and abroad, this will serve as an argument. Nationalism is unhistorical as far as it promotes purity and enclosed entities. Nations never were closed nor pure, and the political ideology is only a response to this exact knowledge. Therefore, we can state that national history in general is about the reconfiguration of collectiveness in a totality. At this point, I would like to come back to the quotation I began my paper with. It stems from Edmund Husserl, Die Krise der europäischen Wissenschaften und die transzendentale Phänomenologie, in English, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, written in the mid-1930s. He wrote, and now I have this quote in English, I didn't include this in the paper. But what has become Europe, a relatively closed shape, is nonetheless something new, that is, the incorporation of the thereby transformed spirituality of the incorporated nation. Equally, the expanded Europe will thus not be Europe any longer, and yet it will be a continuation of what has up until now been the fundamental character of Europe, but also a tremendous deepening. Internal and external expansion of philosophizing the historical existence appears to continuously engender itself as terrestrial humankind in future. End of quote. Leaving aside, as I did in my paper, the philosophical implications of this quote, I would like to underline the tendency Husserl saw of an European continent that by an increasing exchange with non-European persons and regions altered its own character and became an equal part of humankind, not a province, an equal part. He appealed to the Europeans to open themselves to the world and to transform their history of often violently living together into a global experience. Maybe we did not go very far with this endeavor. The prevailing epistemological and methodological separation in European and non-European historiography might be one reason. The experiment to apply a non-European tool to the European context is, in my opinion, the possibility to bridge the gap. It might also help to find ways for comparatively investigating nations and nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, also for keeping with the time. And we're moving on to our last speaker, Luis Jarenga from the University of Tartu, who will be speaking about Russians, refugees, and Europeans, what shapes the ideology of the Conservative People's Party of Estonia.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I should say that perhaps I should exchange the word ideology for discourse. But this has grown out of a paper that I circulated for this conference that was published in a Latvian journal. And what I'm going to be presenting on today is sort of part 2 of that paper, because what I'm doing is I'm taking the initial research question and conducting a 2-case comparative study with the National Alliance of Latvia. But I'm also going to speak about Intermarium and the New Nationalism, and what is considered ethnofuturism. And I should say that my research question was about the change of discourse between the Estonian radical right nationalist party EKRE, that's the Conservative People's Party of Estonia, and the Russian-speaking minority, because in the Baltic states, they're really, and in Central and Eastern Europe as well, I mean, what the radical right has done has othered people who have been there for quite some time. Roma and Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Russian minority, the Russian-speaking minority in the Baltic states. But as Cas Muda, a leading intellectual on the radical right, has noted, 2015, as he said, was an orgy of Islamophobia that changed the nature of the game, because for the first time, there was the possibility of a large number of people arriving in Central and Eastern Europe that were not European. And this gave way to an already aggressive form of nationalism and the radical right. But the reason that I started researching this is because of an answer to a question by one of the EKRE members. And it wasn't so much his answer, but it was who it was said to, where it was said, and to what audience. And that was the American Renaissance Conference, which is run by the alt-right in the United States. Not the Breitbart alt-right, but actual people like Richard Spencer and some of David Duke and some of these other leading intellectuals. And I thought, it's interesting that a 20-year-old Estonian nationalist is over there. And the question that was asked to him was by a Polish nationalist who said, now that there's possibly some refugees coming into your country, wouldn't you want to unite with the Russians because they're white too? And this was all in English because this is an international conference and this is sort of the lingua franca of nationalists. And he said, yes, whenever two white nations meet something that is not white, it's better to fight together, and perhaps when it's done, we can go back to fighting each other, or perhaps maybe not. So that was his answer, and I thought that's interesting that this is where a radical right party member is speaking in front of a non-political group. So Felix and Lalor have noted that a restructuring is taking place within the radical right where new actors have come in, and what they have done is they changed the game, mostly by using social media, but it's what is said, where it can be said, and how acceptable it is. And of course, 2015, besides the refugee crisis, also saw the Twitter president, Donald Trump, which gave incredible momentum to radical right actors in Europe and in the US. And it wasn't necessarily because of him, it's because he is a meme. And what the alt-right does is they use memes and they meme something into reality. So the Twitter president becomes more Donald Trump than Donald Trump himself. And it doesn't necessarily matter what other principles he has that these actors would not agree with him. He becomes a symbol, and it becomes something that is sort of a code word for people that think like us. So they draw on new forms of mobilization and transnational networking, which is what I'm going to speak about, because this is a new form that a lot of people, when I present my research, say that it's not to be taken seriously. How could they resurrect Intermarium? But you know, one of the two things people who studied the radical right said just within the last decade is that there'll never be a neo-Nazi party in Europe, and that a radical right party will not be taken seriously and represented in Germany again. And both of those have now come true. You have Kotleb People's Party in Slovakia and Golden Dawn in Greece, and most recently the AfD won, I think, 12.6 of the votes in the German election, which shocks a lot of people, but a lot of people also saw that coming. So my point is that while this may sound silly to some people, when ideas become mainstream and are freely circulated, they don't necessarily go away, especially when they pick up traction with other like-minded people who can actually use an intelligent articulation of this. So just to briefly describe what I consider a populist radical right party, because I think there's only one or two other political scientists in the audience. It's three pillars. You have populism, nativism, and authoritarianism. And nativism is simply nationalism combined with xenophobia. And if you have all three of those, you can be a radical right party, even if you're different. Like, for example, Hertwilders' PVV is quite different from Jobbik, but they have all three of those, and certain issues like Israel, Russia, and LGBTQT issues are disputed, and different parties have different views on them, but if they are populist, authoritarian and nativist, then they are considered a radical right party. And I place EKRE in Estonia and the Latvian National Alliance firmly within this party family. Just a quick background on EKRE. They jumped from 0 seats in the Estonian parliament to 7 out of a 101-seat parliament in 2015. They ran largely on a populist platform.
I think there's a lag between the slide on the screen and the one you have in front of you.
Okay.
I don't know why this happened, but
What? Okay.
I think maybe you just get out of the presentation and get back in again.
Okay. Well,
Yes.
that. Okay, something is up with that. All right. Well, anyways, I was just going to present a brief background. Party.
That's a different. Here we go.
So, background on EKRE. I'm from Estonia, but I'm not Estonian, so I'm not as tech savvy as the rest of them. But yeah, so a background on EKRE. Basically, they are a merger between a political party and a nationalist grassroots social movement, and they've become very successful because they are able to, as we talked about, sending the telegram to the wrong address. They've essentially become the right address for a specific type of person, and that is people with less education, and that is people who live in the more rural areas of Estonia. But the youth organization, which I'm going to be speaking to, is largely starting to change that. And the National Alliance is one of the most successful radical right parties in Europe. They're essentially considered mainstream in Latvia. They have 17 out of a 100-seat parliament. They're in the government, and they have the Speaker of the Saima, Inara Murnisa, is a member of the National Alliance. And they are affiliated with the ECR in the European Parliament. And why this is substantial is because both parties are making radical right discourses mainstream within their own countries because it's not as controversial. It is slightly controversial in Estonia, but almost not so much in Latvia. And then others who are involved in the Intermarium project are the Nordisk Ungdom, which is basically a neo-Nazi street organization in Sweden, the Azov Battalion led by Andrei Vilitsky, and then they have some other people who are involved who are loosely affiliated or not affiliated with any group, but come from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and Sweden. For some reason, there's a lot of Swedes involved with this. But then they have alt-right actors in the US who have come to Europe and who have been particularly impressed with the vigor and the intellectual capability of some of these actors. And the two people that lead the Intermarium project is a Latvian by the name of Raivis Zeltīts and an EKRE member named Ruben Kalep. And both of them, Raivis Zeltīts is the Secretary General of the National Alliance, and he's only 21 or 22 years old. He's a board member, and he's the leader of the youth organization and sits on the city council of a municipality just outside of Riga. And EKRE member Ruben Kalep, the young man who answered the question I talked about earlier at the American Renaissance, is the leader of Sinane Varatus, which is, translates from Estonian to Blue Awakening, which is the youth organization of EKRE. And he's putting them on the map by doing a bunch of traveling outside of Estonia. He spends most of his time and most of his networking outside of Estonia. And he tweeted that Estonia is the venue through which nationalism will enter the world. And Matthew Cott pointed out in the 2016 article about a far-right hijack of Intermarium, that actually radical nationalist ideas are entering Europe through Latvia, and that the National Alliance and the Latvian government receive more criticism from the Russian Federation for this than they do in Brussels, and in fact it's quite non-existent. So for peace in Poland and Viktor Orban, both of which I consider to be radical right actors, they get a lot of criticism, mostly for their illiberal form of democracy, but actually Brussels has largely ignored this in Latvia. And I should say that, before I move on, that the torchlight parades that you see happening in Charlottesville actually came from Estonia, who borrowed it and appropriated it from the Latvians, because what they do on February 24th, which is Estonia's Independence Day, is they organize a large torchlight parade through Old Town Tallinn. And what they have done is they invited soldiers of Odin and a bunch of the other parties and groups that I have just mentioned to take part in this torchlight parade. And most recently, last year, what they have done is they try to get Lithuanian nationalists and Polish nationalists to go side by side, and Ukrainian nationalists and Polish nationalists to march side by side. Now, it's pretty easy to get Latvian and Estonian nationalists to march side by side. It might be a little bit more difficult to get the other such groups to do it, but they have successfully been able to do it. And then the next day in Stockholm, they organized a large conference where ethnofuturism was described and discussed, and there are now plans for a book on intermarium, which includes an actual geopolitical strategy that this group has. So a devil you don't want to dance with refers to basically this cozy relationship that a lot of Western European radical right parties have with Vladimir Putin. Petr Kreko and Political Capital Institute put out a typology of 3 different types of radical right parties vis-a-vis their relationship with Putin and the Russian Federation. You have the open category, which are people who are on the fence. You have the committed, which are parties like Marine Le Pen's Front National, Jobbik, UKIP, who are very pro-Putin. And then you have the hostile, which wasn't included in this study, and it was very small, but I would add ECRA and the National Alliance to this. They do not like Mr. Putin, and they are not pro-Russia. In fact, one of the main parts of this intermarium project is to counterbalance what they see as their language, not mine, neo-Bolshevism coming from both sides. They see a resurgent and stalwart Russia to the east, and the threat of an invasion or information warfare, any type of subversion of the national sovereignty of Latvia and Estonia. But then they see this sort of neo-Bolshevism coming from Brussels and Washington, D.C., which is, as we mentioned in this conference, this sort of vegetarian cyclists, academics, cultural Marxists, all of these types of buzzwords. So what they're trying to do is unite nationalists from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And this doesn't necessarily include trying for an exit from the European Union. And in fact, a lot of nationalists want to try to use influence in the European Parliament and use national success, especially like what has been going on in Hungary and Poland, to influence the EU that way. That being said, ECRA recently called for their proponents of direct Swiss-style democracy. So up until recently, I would have argued that they're not staunchly anti-EU, because you have to be careful in the Estonian political landscape to be too Eurosceptic. But they recently, I think April or May, called for, at the annual party conference, for a referendum to be held by the Estonian people on their membership in the European Union. And while I don't think that that is going to happen, it's at least something that they're discussing now. And basically, when I say that they're just a bunch of kids, a lot of people also say that young people get involved in these movements and then they leave. But when you have people who are in their early 20s who are sitting on party boards and becoming secretary generals, the intent is not to leave politics. The intent is to keep running and to keep getting involved. And I guess I've gone a little bit overboard, but the idea of intermarium is geopolitical, and they mentioned Trump and the Visegrad Group as sources of inspiration, and that's how this came up, because they were talking about how they were very proud that their Central and East European brothers, as they said, stood up to the EU with the refugee crisis, and now they're trying to adopt a similar discourse in both of their countries. And then lastly, well, I can wrap up, is that ethnofuturism is sort of a common language to unite a very divided nationalism. And what they want to do is they want to create, as they say, white ethnostates in Central and Eastern Europe, and keep everybody unique, keep them individual, and keep them separate, but work together. And this is sort of a globalized ultranationalism of the 21st century. How much this is going to take off, I'm not sure, because I don't have this. I'm in the theoretical part of my research right now. I don't have methodology yet, because I'm waiting for some documents to be published, and I'm waiting to do some further interviews with with people who are involved in not just ECRE and the National Alliance, but I'm hoping to also get some interviews with people in Ukraine and even in Poland. And then to wrap up, because I'm really running out of time, I can send these slides to everybody who's interested, but to go back to my research question that I presented in the paper about if there is a narrowing gap between Russian-speaking Estonians, who it's been found in Estonia and in Latvia that the Russian-speaking community is more critical of accepting refugees than even the Estonians, that there's a linguistic line drawn in the sand that yes, they will definitely accept anybody into the party as long as they're Estonian citizens, people who speak the language and people who are professed patriots of Estonia, but they won't go seeking out people, which is ironic because if they did that, they might even be able to propel themselves to an even higher place in Estonian politics. As it stands right now, they're the second most popular among ethnic Estonians and the third most popular political party. So whether or not they're going to do that, it remains to be seen, but it was told in my interviews that during this election campaign, they would send Russian-speaking members of the party into certain neighborhoods in Tallinn, where there is a large Russian community, to show that if Alexei and Natalia are ECRE, they're not a fascist party. And I'll wrap up from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 15 minutes for discussion. And before we break for lunch, I saw a question over there, 2 and 3. I'll take 3 questions at a time, and then we can have a second round. Barbara, please.
Throughout this conference, all the time thinking about what we are talking about. So I have a question for you. It was really interesting for me because data and the way we analyze this. So the question is, what kind of indicators should we consider if we talk about nationalism? I will give you another example of data. This is the plot of the support for accepting migrants in Poland, which is, as you shown in your data, some phenomena are stable. For instance, the exchange support is more or less stable, but of course we know why. From some time there's a change, which means this increasing resistance to this, which is in red and pink. The pink is medium resistance, the red is high resistance. And the factors which increase this are very similar to your data, which is education and endemic cities, supporting for the party, right-wing party. But in Poland, interestingly, young people are the youngest group of people between 18 and 25 are the most against it. But if we look at another interesting
Against migrants, right?
yes, to Ukrainian migrants, this is kind of stable, right? We know probably the answer is simple. There was no still the huge campaign in media led by politicians against Ukrainian. However, it seems to me that it just has been started. So this is stable as in your schedule. There's no big changes over the time because we don't talk about this. So one of the aspects of this is that the migrants are not here in Poland, but still they are this kind of imagined ethnic group which is a threat. That's why this theory where the ethnic groups are explanation as a threat, it doesn't mean necessarily, of course, that the migrant, the ethnic groups should be in the country to be the subject of anti-ethnic attitudes, of course. Anyway, the question is what kind of indicator you should consider to analyze the problem, because we know why we are here, because of the migrant crisis, which includes the conversation about nationalism or new nationalism.
Thank you. Siegfried?
Yes, also I have a comment. Your newest data are from 2013. It's the data be different if you have the data from 2017 after the migrant crisis. Things have changed. I mean, in Poland they had elections in
2015 elections.
but before that, when was they all?
So the previous had to be 2011, right?
Previous election.
Yes, 2011
Yeah.
and then 2015.
And now, well, political landscape has changed a bit in a few years.
Thank you. Vyacheslav?
Yeah, well, I also have more of a comment on Sarah's presentation, because I think in in the context of this conference, what we see is increasingly that it becomes a self-referential phenomenon. That what matters is a perception of the number of migrants, what matters is the perception of the level of well-being maybe associated with migrants taking away jobs and so on. Not the employment level as such, as the objective data, but something that people perceive. But in this case, of course, the distance between independent and dependent variable becomes too short, because what people perceive is more like a single phenomenon. Migrants, joblessness, whatever, social deprivation, it all comes as a single package rather than as separate phenomena. So I wonder what your comment would be on this. And to Luis, can you comment on the level of support for ECRE among the Russian speakers? And maybe also in Latvia, if you have the data. Because I've heard that it's actually going up, and I think Russians or Russian speakers are actually supporting the conservative nationalists.
Thank you. Would you like to start answering your questions?
Well, I'm not really sure whether I understand your question, Barbara. So you want me to come up with another?
There was a very strict way of measurement of nationalism, which, as a tested measurement, probably it's a very good one. But of course, this is not the only way of measurement. So, what kind of other indicators would you consider as a good or maybe even better?
Well, I could think about this, but you know, the thing about these data is that they are available for a long period of time. So that's a huge advantage of, rather than thinking about new measurements that will not be available for some time, because you have to convince the guys in charge, usually guys, in charge.
Yeah, I'm not talking about this, I'm just asking your opinion about if you have such possibility, of course. I know that the data, you do not project the indicator, right? But in the sense of discussion with indicator. Because what I wanted to point it out is if you, for instance, would say select such indicator, we would ask people in Poland in general about the strangers or about Roma in Poland, you would get different answers, right?
Yes. That's also a trade-off, you know, when you do a cross-national survey, in general, you do not go into the local minorities. You ask questions about the general minorities, because it would be too difficult to compare the Roma in Poland with the, well, Afghanistani in England. So the questions are about minorities in general. And these are conceived of to be valid measurements. So that would be the answer to this. But I understand that you would not be perfectly satisfied with that. I understand. So if you want to go into particular mechanisms for Poland, then you have to rely on your particular Polish data rather than.
What I mean is that if you would change the indicator, maybe you would have the result that this is not so stable.
I mean, if we can maybe continue the dialogue during the break, because I would like to hear more answers to the other questions, and then more people want to ask questions, right?
Answer to your question would be, of course, I would be delighted to have more recent data. But who will pay for that? So it's a huge enterprise.
The results seem to be very optimistic. You also presented it in that way. So it's all the same.
It's stable.
But I guess that it would be very different if you would have had data, really recent data after 2015.
Well, I would say, I would doubt that. Because, you know, these data were collected in the midst of the refugee crisis. Eh?
No, it was before.
No, 2013 was heavy.
2015, it was with the people streaming in from Hungary.
Yeah, but, you know, on an international scale, 2020 was a crucial crucial year in terms of refugee crisis. So, but more in general, so my answer would be, I have collected these data and analyzed these data for a number of topics. And the pattern is always huge differences between countries, minor differences within countries. So actually it's a bit counterintuitive. You would expect people to change under circumstances of huge crisis, but that does not happen too often. It's rather stable.
But you see it in the election results. I mean, AfD is now a big party. It wasn't there before. there is data, but it's election data, which would also be considered.
Yeah, yeah. But not in this data set.
The answer is that these people are extremists, and in the sample we have a very small portion. I don't know. It's not really so well represented in the sample.
Another problem is opinion and the possibility to express it politically. And when there was any possibility to express it before, and now this exists because there's a party that was only created in 2013 in the way it is in Germany, then of course there's a new political opportunity. It doesn't mean that there's an increased racism, there's an increased possibility to express racism in Germany.
And the last question, what would you guess there?
It's about the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable. So I can show you the evidence that it is related in the heads of the people, but we can distinguish these things via factor analyses. So the answer is straightforward empirically. It may be related, it is, and we can show you the correlation between these different concepts that are measured. Yeah.
Louis?
Yep. So to answer the question, yes, in both countries there is an increase in support from the Russian-speaking population to the radical right. In Ekre, my interviews all said that they had the three fastest growing demographics for voters and people who were expressing interest in the party in terms of joining and getting involved were women, young people, and Russians who themselves were young. And in Latvia, the same. I think probably to a lesser extent, but I need to get numbers for that, and I'm especially interested after the next election in Estonia, whether that will translate into actually votes or if it's just people poking their nose around to see. But I also did interviews with Keskekran, the center party in Estonia, which is the party that represents the Russian vote, and every interview -1, every single person said that they had experienced a lot of their voters being dissatisfied and going to Ekre, and they were worried that it would increase, especially when the party split, which happened semi-recently. So yes, but I would say the number isn't large enough to be substantial. The only thing that's kind of interesting about it is for the first time, this party, this demographic who was a target of the radical right, now has people voting for the radical right because of the conservative values that they like. Because in principle, if you take the language out of it, there's a lot of similarities in terms of issues, and the refugee crisis really brought that out.
One more. We have time for one more round of questions. Hannah, Dorota, and Maria Samira. Hannah?
Like you, I saw in your papers there is this, in one way or another, this issue of perception, coming through. That it is the fear. It's not the presence of the migrants, but the fear of the migrants, right? That is really productive of nationalism. And you both spoke about, sort of this production of that nationalism as a negative, positioning has to be produced somehow. And I'm wondering, as we are discussing here, maybe it's a question for you too. We are discussing, what is new and what is old about these nationalisms. But I think about the interwar period. It was also about production and the non-presence of the other. So how many Jews were there in Germany? About 1%. And out of this 1%, this 1% had to be produced into this enemy of the state. And so here we also, I think, we have dealing with the non-present other, the non-present threat that is being generated. It's this phantom that is being generated into a reality, and that is the motor, the engine behind nationalism. So I don't know if I have a question or I have a comment that I would love to kind of, we can discuss now or later if we have time at the conclusion of the conference, because it seems to be the threat through everything, what you were saying.
Thank you. Dorota?
I'd like to ask a question to Helga. I'd like to ask you, presenting, is it some kind of a historiographic project, a vision of a possibility, or is it a description of an existing, let's say, narrative process? And if, I mean, either way, what is métissage in this narrative? What kind of an operating category? Is it a metaphor of interbreeding, let's say, of cultures? And how can you use it to grasp the, let's say, probably existing in some kind of time span, because you're a historian, existing cultural influences on various cultures and nations, etc. Because it has been, I mean, the idea of like intermingling of cultures obviously has been investigated from many angles and perspectives and so on. But it can happen, and we know from history that there can be influence to a degree without what we're talking about, recognition whatsoever. Yeah? There can be, what do you call it, a hybridizing process in some levels. It can be selective, etc. And we can speak about the Ottoman Empire, for example, as a case in point, yeah, where you would have a lot of exchange in material culture, yeah, but not on the cultural level. I mean, cultural in the sense like there are limits, the gates were closed in some ways. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, like Dorota, I come to nationalist studies from the direction of post-colonialism, so I also picked on the concept of métissage. But it seems to me that this whole session, which I greatly enjoyed, proposes a positive approach to the question of nationalism, which is a worrying one. So nationalist discourses very often lead to extreme right-wing positions and to suppression of diversity and persecution of people. Whereas if you compare nationalisms across borders, you might end up with more diversity, which in a sense subverts the danger of this concept at its core. And I was wondering about the possibility of hybridizing nationalist discourses or proposing a hybridization of them in such a way that would lead to questioning the problematic aspects of these discourses. So to come back to métissage, Helga was noticing that in the colonial history of Europe, there haven't really been cases where colonial culture has influenced or altered European cultures. Whereas I'm wondering if nowadays in the post-communist age, well, we have moved beyond post-communism, actually we're in post-EU accession or whatever. I was wondering if this is not all of a sudden becoming extremely relevant, more than it was at the time of colonial empires, because we are witnessing all these former communist countries entering the EU or having already been in the EU for a while and turning into, experiencing new modes of production and new ways of defining their identities against, you've got Eastern versus Western Europe. So I think métissage is becoming extremely productive precisely because it lays the emphasis on the need to compare, to combine, to hybridize. So maybe you have some more comments on this and maybe some examples of how this can be done or has been done quickly.
Can we start from you, Helga?
Yes. Hannah, thank you for this comment. You term it negative. I would say it's a relational category. Maybe it's always related to something, and it doesn't really matter if it's ideal or if it's real, but it's in the proposition of the group. It's there. So, and this is more or less a descriptive level. I don't want to get into a historical judgment from this. Yes, well, the first step really is to look at historiography. How in historiography the question of blending, mixture of several kinds was approached. And as the outcome of most national histories is that a unified and rather homogeneous nation was formed, the question of how valid this judgment is, despite the fact that those historians dealt with processes of heterogeneity or processes of blending and situations of heterogeneity, is still valid. How this judgment of this unity is still valid. So this is rather to contrast the outcome, the narrative outcome, with the, let's say, empirical basis of national historiography. And there I see kind of difficulties. I think the outcome to place a study on national history in this framework of homogeneity and unity is not backed by the empirical data the historians rely on. So this is maybe one point. And then the second thing is if métissage is a metaphor. Yes, of course it is. It's not sufficient at all. And when I say this is a colonial term, there's a lot of I'm trying also to criticize the term and the usage of the term. What I'm not trying to criticize in this is that processes of let's call it blending, existed in the past, and not only in the colony, but also in the European pasts and presents. So yes, this is a term because it's known from one field, and as this is was also, let's say, mostly studied only outside of Europe, it might be useful to use the term to bring a tool of studying into the European countries. One difficulty is, of course, how to define what the elements are that blended, exchanged, mutually related. And the difficulty is not to become too much to not define those parts as being originally and too much Ursprung, and as we would call it in German. Yeah. This is, of course, you have forms of very nationalistic, ethnocentric narratives of ethnogenesis. That's also always teleological narratives. But the idea is that those parts that became intermingled are not pure neither. So there's a ongoing intermingling, and maybe there's also always also a difficulty to define origins of elements. So this is a continuous process then of studying. Is this affirmative to nationalism? I think there's maybe it's my fault because I relate nation to state. So, and there's facts of states, and let's call them nation. So we have, this is why I spoke of national frameworks, for example. So you have social spaces that are defined and partly define themselves as nations. this is not to be confused with nationalism. And then I would say, yeah, there are multiple identities in a national framework, but you have to name it. And this is something that is most often in those national genesis narratives. This is rather obliterated. Thank you. Sorry, for being long.
Perhaps would we try to answer Hannah's question about perceptions and fear and the creation of others?
Yes, okay. Well, there's two sort of different narratives for radical right, and of course I'll have to say that radical right parties are situationally adaptive and they can use both sides of the coin to make the same argument, but what I notice is that in Western Europe, the dominant narrative is this isn't working, look what happened, and in Eastern and Central Europe, it's look at Western Europe, we don't have this, let's not become this. Look at Sweden. For all of the fascination with the sort of Norse and Swedish sort of Viking culture that's in the alt-right and even in the radical right, the obsession now is to look eastward. I mean, there was a sort of interesting meme cartoon on the New Nationalisms Facebook page where it had a map of the Roman Lime with the barbarians up north and Roman culture, and now they sort of had this map where they portray central, the Intermarium region, and everyone else is the barbarians, and this is now sort of what Europe is, and it's a transfer of values. And the narrative is that the people who vote for these parties probably don't see ethnicity in the same way. It's probably just a bit of insecurity with, how they term it, those who are left behind by globalization. And it's not this rampant nationalism, but those are the people who are more or less addressing the questions. So I think that if you look at the radical right voter and then at the radical right personalities who drive the parties, you find a very different type of character. And a recent article by Jens Riedgren came out, I think it was 2017, where he makes the argument that populism is not really that important. Everybody's a populist now, especially when it comes to election time, but that what really makes these parties who they are and what they are is the ethno-nationalist component, that they wouldn't exist without somebody else to point the finger out at and define whoever against them. So I think that that's kind of one big difference, especially in the past 2 years, in terms of the narrative is who xenophobia is directed at. But I think that there should be more studies in the future to try to juxtapose the voter versus the sort of the top level politicians who drive these parties.
If I can add my comment to this, I think it's also fascinating in your case study to see this, I think, a partial overlap, which is true for Central and Eastern Europe in general, between those left behind by globalization in general, so as a social group, and the perception of Central and Eastern Europe as a backward country towards vis-a-vis the West as at the national level, or the geopolitical level. And to some extent, what you find, I think, both in the interwar period and now in Central and Eastern Europe with the radical right, is a symbolic revenge, a sort of like a way to reverse, to turn the tables on the West and say, okay, we're better than you, we can be better than you, because we've always been behind. And there's no point in which we'll actually catch up. So the only alternative for us is to found a different political project which would actually be in the lead. And you see this, I think, in the arguments both in the interwar period and now. And Per, sorry, the last comment?
No.
Nothing?
No.
Then if I can answer your question, because I understand it was also directed to me. Yeah, it's the central thing I work on. And I would have answered I completely agree with you that the other is phantom, that it's not a real community, but a perception of a community that's unreal and sometimes going even against the reality of the existence of that community. It contradicts the existence of the community. But I would argue that the other is never arbitrary. And my interest is particularly in how the other is selected at different historical times and in different contexts. Why is a particular other salient? And there's a double answer to that as well. I think on the one hand, it says more about the people doing the othering than it does about the other, and that's almost a commonplace in anti-Semitism. It says more about the anti-Semites than about the Jews. But this is relevant I mean, and this is, it's fascinating to look at in a historical perspective because you have 1870, 1930s, and now as the three major global economic crises of capitalism. People tend to forget about the 1870s, but it's the first big crisis affecting all of Europe in terms of economy. And that's when anti-Semitism is born. Then the second answer would be that while this is country-specific and it has to do also with a particular moment in the evolution of the country, there is something I see as a similarity between all groups that are typically othered. And that's not necessarily, I mean, not only a marginality, but also a feature of in-betweenness. If you think of Slezkin's interpretation of these groups as being what he calls Mercurians, traders, not primary producers, people who travel and trade in goods and ideas and so on, but they're in between the majority populations. I would take it a step further, and I would say it's people who cross borders in practical and symbolic terms. Here, Mary Douglas's book, Purity and Danger, comes in handy with the threat to order, the things that cross borders pose. And I think if you try to find a commonality between the Jews, the Roma, the migrants of various colors and various shapes and coming from various areas, because it's not just the migrants from the Middle East. Way before 2015, Western Europe was so concerned about the migrants from Eastern Europe, and we tend to forget that after 2015, but that was a real issue, at least in Britain where I was living at the time. So it's migrants of all shapes and colors and places of origin, and also other groups that are seen as not really being primary producers, but somehow in between these groups that are stable and rooted. And that would be my answer. And with this, I think we have to close and go to lunch. And I would like to thank all of our presenters for arranging the time.
Have you actually learned these languages to interview these guys?
Well, I mainly do the English because they